welcome back. And now for the news in detail. We start from Afghanistan, whose government says any peace talks with the Taliban will be held after national elections scheduled for September the 28th. Presidential spokesman Siddiqui says it will be up to newly elected government to negotiate with the insurgents. Last week, US President Donald Trump called off the peace talks with the Taliban over the killing of an American soldier in Afghanistan. The Taliban said the decision to cancel peace talks will lead to the further loss of American lives and assets. Russia has called for the resumption of peace talks between the Taliban and the US. A foreign ministry spokesperson says a visiting Taliban delegation has repeated its willingness to continue the dialogue. The Taliban representatives arrived in Moscow yesterday. They met the Russian President's special envoy for Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov. Taliban spokesperson Suhail Shaheen says recent developments in the Afghan peace process were discussed in the meeting. Taliban media outlet, the Afghan Islamic Press, says the delegation also plans to visit China, Iran, and the Central Asian states. For more on this, we are joined by Singapore-based political analyst James Dorsey. So thank you for taking time out for Indus News. First of all, the dialogue between the US and the Taliban has concluded without tangible results. Both the sides say they will no longer negotiate to end the war in Afghanistan. What effect will this, do you think, have on Afghanistan, especially when we talk about the upcoming presidential elections?
Short term, I think we're going to see stepped up violence, both on the part of the Taliban and the way that the United States is likely to respond to it. Having said that, actually, there was more or less an agreement. The Americans and the Taliban had agreed on the terms of a U.S. withdrawal, and President Trump is often speaks in superlatives, so I would not take his word dead literally necessarily. I think the fundamental problem here is twofold. One is on the part of what the Americans said to the Taliban, which is the Americans did not say you have to declare an end to the armed struggle. What they said was, we cannot tolerate you attacking our forces and others while we are talking. And that's not an unreasonable position to take. More fundamentally, of course, the projection of these peace talks was one in which it was about U.S. withdrawal rather than about the future of Afghanistan and the terms of that Afghans between each other would agree on for the future governance of the country.
Mr. James, Moscow insists both the US and the Taliban should resume the dialogue. Do you think the peace process will be revived anytime soon?
I think there's several elements here. It's sort of typical. The Americans say one thing, the Russians will say the opposite. So obviously, after the President Trump canceled the talks with the Taliban, the Russians are going to say we should be talking. Now, having said that, I think both sides have a vested interest in talks. That is to say, President Trump has made a point in his electoral promises that he wants a withdrawal from Afghanistan prior to next year's U.S. presidential election. And he has not had many foreign policy successes, so he has an interest in getting these talks back on track. From the Taliban's perspective, getting the bulk of the foreign forces out of Afghanistan was one of their major objectives. Having said that, they're also in an advantageous position for the future of Afghanistan, precisely because the Americans have focused less on talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government and more on the aspect of a U.S. withdrawal.
So you have been following the dialogue between the US and the Taliban. Can you give us some insight into what irritates both the sides, or what are the hurdles in achieving the eventual target?
What prompted this was that on the Thursday before President Trump was supposed to meet with the Taliban leaders at Camp David outside of Washington, you had a Taliban attack in which a U.S. soldier was killed, as well as 11 others. Now, the Taliban obviously wanted to demonstrate their ability to attack and to increase pressure on the United States. The problem with it is it had exactly the opposite effect. It's delayed the talks.
Thank you, Mr. James Dorsey, the political analyst based in Singapore. Now moving on, Pakistan's military says unprovoked Indian fighting in Nikyal and Jandrod sectors along the line of control killed a woman. It said another 6 people were wounded. The injured were evacuated to a nearby medical facility. Tension between India and Pakistan increased after New Delhi stripped occupied Kashmir of its autonomy on 5th of August. New Delhi's decision to revoke occupied Kashmir special status has been challenged in India's Supreme Court. The Jammu and Kashmir People's Conference filed a petition calling President's rule in the occupied valley unconstitutional and void. The petition said India does not have the power to arbitrarily change the political form of occupied Kashmir. It has been submitted that Kashmir has been locked down for over a month, showing a constitutional change enacted against the people's wishes. Earlier, several petitions were filed in India's Supreme Court after the revocation of occupied Kashmir's special status. Members of the US Congress have reiterated their criticism of the Indian government for imposing a complete lockdown in the occupied Kashmir. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib has condemned India's revocation of occupied Kashmir's special status. In a statement, she also slammed the communications blackout India has imposed and its suppression of life-saving medical care. Tlaib demanded that India and its widespread violence, torture, and other human rights violations against Kashmiris. She urged New Delhi to accept responsibility for the violations and hold the involved officials accountable. Meanwhile, a group of 7 congressmen have urged the US ambassadors to India and Pakistan to play their role in easing the tensions. Members of the European Parliament have called for trade and travel sanctions on India over the alarming human rights situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Richard Corbett, co-chair of the Friends of Kashmir group, called for utilizing all possible means to pressurize India to lift its curfew in the valley. Addressing a conference organized in the European Parliament, Corbett proposed the imposition of trade sanctions on New Delhi. He also said travel restrictions for those involved in the acts of terrorism in Indian-occupied Kashmir should be imposed. Earlier, the EU members had a chance to meet the victims of unprovoked attacks from India on the line of control. President of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, Sardar Masood Khan, was also present at the conference. Masood Khan welcomed the European Parliament's decision to hold a debate on the situation in the occupied valley. The Indian government is building its first detention center for the illegal immigrants in the northeastern state of Assam. The pace of construction has picked up after the state government issued a list of citizens last month that tendered 2 million people stateless. More in this report.
India's hardline Hindu nationalist government has targeted religious and ethnic minorities since first assuming office in 2014. It's turned up the heat since being re-elected in May. First, it revoked the special constitutional status of Indian-occupied Kashmir and imposed an indefinite curfew across the valley. Then, the BJP state administration in Assam issued a list of citizens which deprived Muslim immigrants of their fundamental rights. Labourers have cleared a forest the size of 7 football fields to build the state's first detention centre for immigrants deprived of Indian citizenship.
There will be 15 4-story buildings under construction here, 13 for males and 2 for females.
Some of the workers said they are among the 2 million people declared stateless by the Assam government. They fear they could end up in the detention camp they are building.
Those who do not have their names in the National Register of Citizens would be kept here. India's biggest detention camp is being constructed here.
Despite New Delhi's decision to disenfranchise millions, Dhaka has refused to accept anyone declared an illegal immigrant by India.
In Hong Kong, clashes have erupted between pro and the anti-government protesters in a shopping mall. Hong Kong police moved in to break up scuffles and detained several demonstrators. Parts of Hong Kong have been paralyzed over the past 3 months due to protests and street battles between demonstrators and police. The demonstrations started after the government introduced a bill that would have allowed the extradition of people to mainland China. The Turkish Foreign Ministry says the OIC will hold a meeting in Jeddah on Sunday to discuss Israel's plan to annex areas of the occupied West Bank. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he would annex the Jordan Valley and other illegal settlements if he wins elections next week. Middle Eastern and the EU countries expressed alarm at Israel's intention. Arab foreign ministers also condemned the plan as aggression and said it would undermine any chances of peace settlement with the Palestinians. The Jordan Valley is part of the occupied West Bank that Israel captured in 1967 war. Israeli forces have shot and wounded 58 Palestinians during weekly protests along the Gaza border. Palestinian officials said 3 of the protesters sustained serious wounds. The Gaza-based officials said 31 of the demonstrators were hit by live ammunition. They said another 27 were injured by rubber-coated rounds. Dozens of other Palestinian protesters fell ill after inhaling tear gas fired by Israeli troops. Israeli forces have killed over 300 Palestinians and wounded about 18,000 others since weekly protests began in March 2018. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says he will discuss purchasing Patriot missiles from the US with President Donald Trump. In an interview, Erdogan said his personal bond with Trump can avert potential US sanctions over Turkey's buying the Russian S-400 air defense system. He said it is not rational for the US to hurt longtime ally Turkey with sanctions. Talking about the Syrian refugee crisis, Erdogan warned Turkey would allow refugees to cross into Europe if it does not get more financial assistance. He said Turkey has spent $40 billion to cope with the people fleeing the Syrian war. Drone attacks have been launched on 2 oil facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia, sparking fires. The Interior Ministry says the blazes at the 2 Saudi Aramco units in Abqaiq and Khurais provinces have been brought under control. The 2 eastern provinces contain the world's 2 largest oil processing plants. Yemen's Houthi rebels have claimed the responsibility for the attacks, saying 10 drones were used. More stories to follow right after a short break. Stay tuned with Indus. Welcome back. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has called a joint sitting of the parliament to discuss rising gender-based violence. In a letter to parliamentary leaders, Ramaphosa called for measures to protect women and girls against abuse and violence. National Assembly Speaker Thandi Modise has scheduled the special session for September the 18th. Gender violence has been brought to fore in South Africa with the rape and murder of a 19-year-old student earlier this month. Thousands of people marched on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange yesterday to call for listed companies do more to end gender-based violence.
Most incidences of gender-based violence that happen in the workplace come from the private sector, and it remains silent because they don't do anything about it. They don't have the necessary policies within their environment in order to deal with those things. So we want them to do better and not be silent. Like wearing black and having a moment of silence is not enough.
The death toll of the flash floods in eastern Spain has risen to 5. Severe weather warnings were issued after torrential rains burst riverbanks and swept away cars. Rescue workers have evacuated 3,500 people from the flood-affected regions. Torrential rains have caused chaos with 2 airports in Murcia and Almeria closing down. Details in this report.
Stranded passengers at the hallway of Alicante Airport wait on the floor. Some have decided to sleep as they wait for better weather before heading out to their accommodation. Local authorities have cautioned people to stay indoors in the worst affected areas.
The wait in the queue here is 4 or 5 hours. So it's very difficult to get to the toilet, impossible to get anything to eat. I'm also diabetic. I have insulin in my bag. In about 1 hour's time, I'm going to have to take injections or eat one or other, and I don't think it's possible to eat or drink.
Travellers say most airport taxis are not operating, and those that are have become expensive.
It's just unbelievable. Standing here for many hours. I've been traveling now for 24 hours from Iceland to here. And standing here at the airport for many hours waiting for a car.
The National Weather Service says the regions of Valencia, Alicante and Murcia will be hit by similar storms today.
A new storm has brought rain and winds to the Bahamas, still reeling from the Category 5 Hurricane Dorian. The National Hurricane Center says it could become a tropical storm. It says the weather system is likely to pick up speed as it moves northwest, probably hitting Florida later today. The tropical cyclone is not expected to bring the same level of devastation as Hurricane Dorian. With 1,300 people still missing, the Bahamian government is focusing on search and rescue operations. On his arrival in Nassau, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres pledged aid and assistance to the hurricane victims.
But in relation to islands of the Caribbean, one thing is clear. Climate change is already here. It's not a threat to the future. It's happening. And it's happening with devastating impacts. And so it is absolutely essential to have a very relevant investment in resilience and adaptation.
Halloween came early to Los Angeles as Universal Studios Hollywood opened the doors to its horror nights. More in this report.
Halloween Horror Nights is an annual event at the amusement park. Classic horror films or television shows are transformed into interactive experiences. The creepy evenings are open at Universal Studios Orlando and Hollywood, with the express intention of scaring the wit out of visitors. People randomly go through a house and hear the lines they want to hear. The result is a maze that does not skimp on the silliness or the screams, whilst guests see some of the best scenes from their favorite movies. Last year, the Stranger Things maze encompassed season 1, and this year it is all about season 2 and 3.
I thought it was lovely, really lovely. I mean, it's just very nostalgic, mostly for me. It's just lovely to see the imagery. And what a good job they did.
And that wasn't too scary?
Not too scary for me. The imagery wasn't that surprising. And I was involved in approving it, so I knew sort of what was coming.
After the red carpet, Dan Aykroyd and Ghostbusters director Ivan Reitman dared to try the maze, featuring classic imagery like the green ghost Slimmer and the giant marshmallow man.
I'm excited because, you know, the Ghostbusters comes from research my great-grandfather did in the 1920s into spiritualism. He was kind of serious about the subject, but here we are so many decades later, and it's, you know, 4 movies, record, television shows, and now a maze exhibit. Yeah, it's pretty neat to see how long it's lasted, like the endurance of the thing.
Halloween Horror Nights at Universal Studios Hollywood will run until November 2nd.
And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. Thank you for watching, and for further updates, stay tuned to Indus News.